Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hey everybody, this is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth, and today I've got with me Stephanie Arnold, and you may have seen her on the Netflix series Surviving Death, and I was fortunate enough to be able to reach out to Stephanie and schedule this interview. She's got a fascinating story. So I'm going to read her bio, and then we're going to get started and just have a conversation as we always do. Before Stephanie Arnold died, she had been an Emmy-nominated award-winning TV producer who spent nearly 3 decades creating and producing TV shows, music videos, and documentaries. Then she met the love of her life, and Stephanie decided the only thing she wanted to produce was a family. Little did she know this fateful decision would quite literally lead her on to the end of one life and the beginning of another. It was during the birth of her second child that Stephanie suffered a rare but often fatal condition called an amniotic fluid embolism, or an AFE, and died on the operating table for 37 seconds. Everything she does at this time is a direct result of her survival of that experience. As I mentioned earlier, she's currently streaming on Netflix Surviving Death, which is an excellent series. It's a 6-part series on Netflix. I just finished watching it. It's great. She's become an award-winning international best-selling author and an inspirational speaker on a mission to help others realize that connecting with their intuition can not only enhance their lives, but can very well save them. So with that, I want to welcome Stephanie Arnold to Grief to Growth.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Yes, Stephanie, I really want to let people know who you are, about what your experience has been, and kind of what you got out of it. So I'll let you start where you'd like to start in terms of telling us about your experience.
From the catalyst, or my previous life, or my second life?
Yeah, really good. It's always interesting when I interview people that have had these life-changing moments. And when people ask me to tell my story, I usually start in the middle, because it's that's where things change. There's an event that changed things. So it's up to you. If you want to start with, I could even ask you, did you have experiences like this before? Or we could start with your actual experience that your book's about.
Well, we can start with the experience and meander around. We'll go off on tangents.
Sure.
So I met my husband in 2008, and then he relocated me from LA. I was producing reality shows, and at that time I was like, wow, I met the love of my life. This is worth giving up everything. And so I relocated to Chicago, and then we started to produce a family, like you said. Mm-hmm. So the first baby, so I have a stepdaughter who I've known since she was 2 years old. So she was my first, if you will. And then the second one was through 3 rounds of IVF. And I had no problems, no issues with the pregnancy, except she was 41 weeks. And I needed a C-section because she was almost 9 pounds. Mm. So that was the only complication I had. And then the second one, Jacob, I was pregnant with after 7 rounds. And during the first 20 weeks of the pregnancy, everything was fine. Had no Charlie horses, no acid reflux. No, I was like, I get pregnant with boys all the time this way. Mm-hmm. And then about the 20-week ultrasound, I was diagnosed with a placenta previa, which is basically the placenta growing on top of the cervix. And it's a 1 in 200 risk, where basically, as the uterus grows, the placenta will move out of the way. But if it doesn't, then the worst case scenario is you get a C-section. Mm. And my husband and I were splitting our time between New York and Chicago, and the radiologist had come in, which is slightly different than if you were in a regular doctor's site. And the radiologist said, you have this, but I'll be back. And I looked at my husband and I said, I don't know what this is, but I have a bad feeling about this. It just hit me like a ton of bricks. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And, my husband's a PhD from University of Chicago. He is an economist. He is a former Air Force pilot. He is somebody who is very analytical, data-driven. He really likes to process everything and look at all of the stats before he makes any kind of decision. And what I was saying to him was a knee-jerk reaction. So for him, he was like, honey, we don't have all the information. We'll ask the doctors. You have prenatal care. Let's figure this out together. But there was just this knowing I had that there was just something off. And so when I went home, of course, Dr. Google starts Googling everything. And I'm like, oh, a placenta previa can turn into an accreta, which is what Kim Kardashian had, which is basically when the placenta merges, almost like a lava lamp where the organs of the placenta and the uterus combine. Then if that happens, you might bleed. If you bleed, you might need a hysterectomy. If you need a hysterectomy, you could hemorrhage out. And if you hemorrhage out, you and the baby could lose your life. And I sat back and I said to my husband, I said, this is going to happen to us. The only difference is the baby's going to be fine. And of course, my husband looks at the computer and he's like, come on, what you're looking at is half of a percent chance. That's the miracle baby behind me walking around.
That's cool.
Jacob, wave hi. And then he's like, it's not going to happen. That's the worst case scenario. And so then what ended up happening was, I was like, okay, but I'm on, all right. So then he's like, this is not going to happen. But I knew it was almost like, that knowing when you meet somebody and you're like, this person's a bad person. I don't know what it is, but it's bad. Or I don't know how I know this, but I know it. But it was like that. So then I didn't stop there. I talked to everybody I knew. I talked to the doctors. I talked to the nurses. I was like, my placenta previa is going to turn into a accreta. I'm going to need hemorrhage. I'm going to need hysterectomy and I'm going to die. And you're going to put me under general anesthesia. I'm going to be cut from sternum to pelvis. Like I sounded like a lunatic. I sounded like an absolute crazy person. And, in all of the doctors' defenses, the tests were not showing what I was seeing. They were doing ultrasounds. They were doing blood workup. They were doing, they were taking notes. They were saying, Miss Arnold, maybe you're just stressed. My husband was worried that maybe there was something wrong with baby because this was not typical behavior of me. So he didn't want to put out anything into the universe that it was negative. And I'm like, I find that interesting now because I'm like, you don't claim to be a spiritual person, but yet you don't want to put things out into the universe. Like how he's like, well, I believe in energy, so okay, I'm like, okay. So then we had, at some point I spoke to my OB who asked me if I was still having these visions. And these weren't just dreams. This was something that was sticking with me. This was like, I talk about the difference between a premonition and a casual thought. I mean, if you're sitting on a plane and you're like, oh, planes can crash and this plane can crash. And oh my God, this plane can crash. And then that is a casual thought. It's fleeting. It's momentary. You're thinking of it. It pops in your head. A real premonition is something that sticks with you. It never lets up. And this never let up. This was something I was thinking about day and night. And I was racing against the clock because I was sure that the day that I delivered this baby was the day I was going to die. So call it maybe my producer's instinct. And, I used to work in TV and I used to produce television. And so with TV, it's high stress. It's very, and I functioned really well under a lot of pressure. But I did a lot of research. So at the end of the day, I asked my OB, I said, if I need a hysterectomy, what happens? Or we had a friend of ours who's a gynecological oncologist. And what they do is that they perform surgeries on reproductive organs that have cancer. And so they're high risk surgeries. And so he says, Stephanie, look, what happens which you're not going to need a hysterectomy. But if in fact you do, OB would transfer you to maternal fetal medicine, but you really wouldn't want an MFM to do it. You'd want a gyn-onc to do it because they have more experience. So I make an appointment with the head of gyn-onc at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. And, you know, we're sitting in the waiting room. My husband went with me to every single appointment. And so he is sitting there and, you know, he loves me and he wants me to be okay. But this was more than the tools that he had in his toolbox to deal with. You know, this was the unknown, and this is not comfortable for him. So he's sitting in the waiting room, and we're seeing women who are suffering from cancer, and they have IVs in their arm and they have no hair. And he's like, I'm embarrassed to be here. And I said, I don't know what to tell you. I said, everybody's telling me I'm fine. And, you know, everybody sees this open road and I see this 18-wheeler heading straight for me. Maybe this doctor has heard something of foreboding or this impending doom, you know, during pregnancy, because, and maybe he'll have some answers. So, so we go sit in this consultation room with him and his resident, and there's, you know, she's taking notes. And the doctor says, Mrs. Arnold, how can I help you? And I said, well, my placenta previa is going to turn into an accreta. I'm going to need a hysterectomy. You're going to perform the hysterectomy in a couple months. I see you, you see me, you're my doctor. So he stops and he says, Mrs. Arnold, have you been on the internet? And I said, why, yes, I have, but this is going to happen. And he's like, okay, well, let's get an MRI. If the MRI is positive for an accreta, then I'll schedule myself to be available for you on your day of delivery. Okay, great, no problem. So I do the MRI. The MRI is negative for an accreta. And my husband looks at me and he says, you should feel relief. You should feel, you know, much better. And I said, no, I feel much worse because now I'm running out of people to tell this crazy foreboding story to. So I take to Facebook. So now we're at a point where I'm like, no one's listening to me. So I take to Facebook. I'm like, if anybody has my blood type, I'm going to need it. I write goodbye letters. I sent out goodbye letters. I talked to, if you saw me in a coffee shop and said, how's your pregnancy? I'd be like, I'm going to die. Yeah. Like friends, everybody stayed away from me. And I think they were just holding their breath, just waiting for me to deliver and just move on. Right. Like let's just get rid of the anxiety, whatever this is. You know, and at some point my OB told me, I think you need to have a consultation with anesthesia. And so I made a phone call to anesthesia. And she said, she was telling me where I would recover, what would happen with the epidural, all these things. And I said, great, I've had this before. I've had a baby before. I said, but what happens in the event that this, and this happened? And she said, she was startled by the way that I was speaking. But at the end of the day, she tried to reassure me and said, you're in a teaching hospital. We have you covered. And she said, she'll never forget the last words I said to her, which were, it is what it is. Like, yeah. This was my last ditch effort. There was no one else to talk to. There was no one else to consult with. And so at 36 weeks to the day, my husband is on a business trip to New York. I'm supposed to deliver at 37 weeks. 36 weeks to the day, I start bleeding on the kitchen floor, and I know that I'm having this baby today. So I get to the hospital. Jonathan's on a plane heading back. They triage me in. They're like, you know what? The ORs are quiet. I think that now's the time that we should take Jacob. And I kiss my daughter a million times, and I'm trying to have that motherly instinct of not having, I kiss my daughter a million times, and they're assuring her that she's going to be, that I'm going to be back with her brother. And my mother's instinct kicks in, and I don't cry. And I'm just like, I don't want the last thing that she sees for me to be breaking down. And I'm texting my husband on the Skype chat, and I'm telling him that he's made me the happiest woman in the world and pleased to take care of our children. And he's still not getting it. And I'm very conscious that these are the last words he is ever going to read from me. But he's like, where do I meet you? And I said, 8th floor recovery, hopefully. They wheel me back. And as they gurney me back, I I tell my doctor, I said, there's something wrong. You need to put me under general anesthesia. And
Mm.
she said, I'm not going to do that because it's going to put you to sleep and the baby to sleep. And so it's too dangerous. And I know you're nervous because Jonathan's not here, but I need you to trust us and we've got you covered.
Mm.
And I said, okay. And that was my last ditch effort, right? I'm being wheeled into the room that's going to give life to my son and take mine. And I am acutely aware of how heavy this pressure is because I can't go anywhere. I'm not getting out of this. Like there, if you're having elective surgery and you're having a foreboding feeling, you just don't do the surgery. But this is not an option for me. So they prepare me for a C-section. They put a curtain in front of my face. I'm in it, on the table. And at that point, I don't remember much of anything else. They tell me there was about 15 minutes before they delivered Jacob, but they said when they were talking to me, I was kind of catatonic. So I feel like I scared myself out of my own body. Like when you get scared to death, like I was just there, but I wasn't there. And so they were talking to me and I wasn't answering. And they deliver a happy, healthy baby boy. And seconds later, I died.
Wow. Wow. I like to pause here just for a second to understand some things. You obviously, this feeling was intense. I mean, and you were not about to let it go. Even everybody's telling you, Stephanie, you're just imagining this. So what was it? Was it a feeling? Were there visions? And what made you so confident that it was real?
All of the above. It was a heaviness I felt around everything. I was conscious I had 3 months to save my life, and I was trying to enjoy moments with my daughter and with my husband and with my stepdaughter. But I couldn't because there was this just heaviness around every single moment. Every time I would talk to somebody new, I was just hoping maybe I'd get an answer from them of something that a cousin, a family member, a friend had gone through, but it wasn't coming. I was having visions of as soon as I saw a lava lamp in my head, which I describe as the placenta accreta with that's exactly what it looked like. And I felt it happening in my body. I was walking through a park and it was a cold winter day and the fountain was dry. And then in my mind's eye, it started flowing, but then it turned to blood. And then I had a visceral reaction to that as my body started to hemorrhage. I had a visceral reaction to that blood. And then all of a sudden I felt my body hemorrhage. And then I raced to the ER with my husband and my daughter. And they were like, Mrs. Arnold, are you okay? And I said, no, I'm hemorrhaging. And they were like, no, you're not. Everything's fine. Baby's fine. Amniotic fluid's fine. Everything's good. And my husband's like, okay, it's a false alarm. And I'm like, no, this is a warning. So I was so confident there wasn't even, I wasn't even questioning how I was getting this information. Many people might have questioned, or after somebody has told me before, after the fifth and sixth doctor told you were just stressed and, the tests are negative, I would have shut up. And I said, then you would have stayed dead.
Yeah. So, and you had, because I've heard your story and I know that you had some intuition before where things had come true. So I'm wondering if that might have played into the fact that you were so confident that this was real.
As a kid, when I had certain visions, somebody ended up dying. And when that happens as a kid, I think you believe you're willing it to happen. At least that's for me. And so when that happened, I shut it down. I didn't want to see it. I was like, this is not what I wanted. I don't want any part of it. So when this is your own foreboding and you have the love of your life and your family and you're just like, no, this cannot be happening. I didn't worry about being judged. I mean, everybody thought I was crazy, but at that point I was already off the rails. So it was like, okay, judge me. I don't care, but somebody's got to hear me. Because the biggest issue I had was that my doctors, who have known me for close to a decade, were sitting there saying, everything's fine. Maybe you're just stressed. But this was abnormal behavior for me. They knew who I was. I'd had a baby before. I'd had a C-section before. So, and I was used to high pressure. So for them, they were missing that really important point. And had they listened differently, I think, as any patient would, and as any patient has experienced in with clinicians, when you're not being heard, it's very frustrating. So I think the difference would have been, had I known that they were listening, and even with the anesthesiologist, had I known she had heard me, I would have been slightly calmer. Still would have been scared,
Sure.
but slightly calmer that somebody had heard me and prepared for the inevitable in my mind.
Well, the thing is, this goes against doctors' training. They're taught to be materialists and taught to be rationalists, and so I think maybe they actually even shut down their intuition and shut down the fact that you might be having a real feeling here. But the spoiler alert: one of them at least did hear you, and
Right.
so I'll let you continue from there.
What ended up happening was so I flatline, and only for 37 seconds, regardless, still time forever standing still, right? So I flatline, and I ended up having an amniotic fluid embolism, which is a very rare 1 in 40,000 risk, where amniotic cells get into the mother's bloodstream. And if you happen to be allergic to it, your body goes into an anaphylactic shock. And in most cases, you don't make it. And just to give you perspective, Northwestern's been in existence for over 30 years. At the time of my AFE, my amniotic fluid embolism, they had 10, 6 did not make it. The other 3 were in permanent vegetative states.
Wow.
And so, in my case, I predicted a lot of what was going to happen. I didn't have a name for it, but there was one thing I didn't predict. The OR was stocked with extra blood in a crash cart. And those were what ultimately saved my life. And later I had asked what happened, and the anesthesiologist said she was very uncomfortable. This is a fellow anesthesiologist having a consultation with me. And she said, I was very uncomfortable with the fact that you had had a baby before, I'd had a C-section before, was speaking so clearly about what was going to happen, and had sought out specialists to save your life. And with that one phone call, she, unbeknownst to me, flagged my file and incorporated those life-saving measures. That is 100% why I'm alive today. And functioning. Ultimately, had I known, and had she told me she was going to take it more seriously, I think I would have been a little calmer going in. I still would have been scared out of my mind, but I think knowing somebody had heard me, and her own intuition was what flagged it. I feel that had I known that she had heard me, I probably would have felt slightly better.
Wow. Yeah, that had to be. I can only imagine how frustrating that must have been. But a good thing is that someone did hear you. So you did have this flatline experience at 37 seconds, and I guess that was recorded because it's a very precise number that you give.
It does. Well, when I asked how long the heart had stopped, they had said, the anesthesiologist had told me 37 seconds, and I'm like, okay, that's an interesting number, right? So now I see 37 everywhere, like in restaurants and in my gate at an airport or something. I'm like, okay, I know everything's going to be fine. Like that's my number of safety now.
Yeah.
It's interesting how that works.
So you have this flatline experience, and from my understanding is because you went into a coma. I'm going to let you tell the story, but so go ahead.
Right.
Go ahead.
No. So, so all of this happens. So if you're lucky enough to, and if your audience wants to learn more about what an amniotic fluid embolism is, they can go to afesupport.org, and they can learn a lot more about all the details about it and how they can get help, or if family members are register. But so the first half of it is cardiac arrest. You seize, you lose your breath, everything just shuts down. If you're lucky to survive that, and 40% are, then the next phase starts, which is DIC, which is your body's inability to clot blood. I am O negative. Your normal body has about 20 units of blood. I was given 60 units of blood and blood product to save my life. And the acronym that anesthesiologists use with DIC, because it stands for disseminated intervascular. I see my husband's fills in the, that there was neurological deficit, but probably way before this, because I do malapropisms all the time and he makes fun of me because I can't remember certain things, or get things confused. But they use the term death is coming. So it is one of the most lethal things one can have during a delivery. It is one of the leading causes of maternal death.
Yeah.
And they were prepared. So ultimately, I get stabilized and Jonathan arrives at the airport. And the doctors to this day say they're very happy he was an Air Force pilot and he was unemotional about things, because when you have a patient's family member who comes in and they're hysterical, it's very difficult to discuss everything with you. But for him, he was like, anesthesiologists and Air Force pilots definitely work well together. So he's like, what's mortality, morbidity? What do we have to do to get to the next stage? Where is she right now? How do we deal with, all of this? And so they said, whatever you do, don't look up amniotic fluid embolism. Of course you're going to, and
Right.
all you see are widower sites, basically. Like it's really bad. And then he says to the doctor, he says, if she needs a hysterectomy, this is the doctor we met with 2 months before. And they took note of it. They thought it was strange, but they still took note of it. And they said, well, right now she won't survive another surgery. So we've stabilized her and maybe she won't need it. So go back to the SICU and the surgical ICU. And Jonathan is sitting there, and about 7 hours later, the bells and whistles go off. And I'm still hemorrhaging. So they call in the gyn-onc that I had met with 2 months before to perform the hysterectomy. They do the pathology on the uterus and they see that an accreta had started to form, but so microscopic, and where it was located was not in a place where the MRI had picked it up. And so basically all of the visions I had had prior had come true. My husband likes to joke and say, yes, all except I knew you were going to survive. So I was right too. And I was like,
yeah,
all right, I'll give that one to you.
Yeah, it is interesting, because I was thinking as I was listening to your story and earlier, you were right and you were wrong, and because you thought, okay, you knew that you were going to die and the baby was going to live, and that clearly didn't happen, but everything leading up to that did happen. So it does bring up this question of free will versus predestination, and can we change our fates? And we know that there are psychics that will tell us that certain things are going to happen. So what are your feelings about those things?
I know exactly how I feel about this. And I have this conversation a lot with my husband. So my husband says, if you believe in predetermination, then your expiration date is your expiration date. I said, yes. I said, but I don't believe free will and predestination or predetermination are on the same path. I feel like maybe it was always in my cards I was going to survive, but how well I survived was due to my free will.
Yeah, and the thing is, we think of it as a either or, and I'm just I think it might be a little bit of both. And I don't know how that works, but I do know that people that have had near-death experiences tell us that time is an illusion. And I was interviewing someone just a little while ago, and she said everything is actually happening at once.
Yeah, that is true.
And from our perspective, we have this, we spread things out in time. So it's mind-blowing to me, but and then the thing is, as you said, do we have an expiration date? Yes or no, or maybe we don't really know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert in God, expiration date, predetermination. All I know is that this is what happened. I survived it. There are many others who survive not well, and so if I have the free will, I have the free will to speak up, and so I could have easily just shut up and not said anything. Now I can't go back and do an empirical data test and say, okay, let's do this again. And I won't say anything and let's see how well I survive or how not well I survive. And, but my gut tells me that me speaking up and having the doctors prepared is what helped me neurologically and helped save me in my organ functions in a different way, because I didn't lose oxygen I don't think I lost oxygen at all, but the reason is because they were prepared, but the doctors have gone on TV and said, I prepared them. So they wouldn't have prepared. I mean, I spoke at a medical school once, and the faculty advisor at University of Chicago said, I am not going to prepare every OR for every histrionic, neurotic, pregnant woman who's going to say this. I said, I'm not asking you to. What I'm asking you to do is listen to your own intuition, because you have it, and so do your patients. And so it's just taking an extra moment and saying, like I said, the one thing my doctors were missing was this was not typical behavior for this patient. They have known me for years. And so something was up. And so now in hindsight, they say, yeah, in hindsight, there was a different behavior because you're not like this. And that's all anyone can do is say, okay, use your voice. When you sense something, say something. What's the worst that could happen? You're wrong. Okay, well, you will never regret speaking up and being wrong, but you will regret not speaking up and being dead right.
Yeah. Yeah. The lesson I take from it, Stephanie, is that we have to trust our intuition. And I think and maybe that's as far as we need to go. The thing is, I work with a lot of people who have parents whose children have passed away. And a lot of times we think, well, I should have known something. I should have said something. I should have done something. And so a little bit of my concern is that people tend to have this, when I think, well, I can control everything. And I should have. And so what would your response to that be?
Yeah. I mean, I'm starting a podcast called Knowing, which is about, we don't know how we know, we just do. And, one of my interviews, he said, I had these visions that my wife was going to die. Like I had this, during her pregnancy, and it was just this heaviness, and he couldn't stop it. Ultimately, she did. And he said, the dream prepared me, like the vision prepared me. So your intuition is there to guide you, to be a compass, to help you know when something really right or really wrong is going to happen. Doesn't mean by you inserting yourself into the narrative, you're going to be able to change the outcome. Maybe in my case, the way that me speaking up helped save me differently than what I would have, but I would have always survived, but maybe I would have been in a permanent vegetative state. I don't know. And I have spoken to people who have had dreams, who have had intuitive moments. I could not stop what was going to happen, even though they talked about it. This man talked about it. This man talked to the doctors about it, but it still was going to happen. So they say that it just prepared them a little differently, because it wasn't as much of a shock to their system when ultimately it happened. I mean, Dr. Mary C. Neal talked about it in Surviving Death, how horrific to know this and then feel relief when he gets to his 18th birthday, then tell him that you're holding your breath and then for it to happen.
Yeah.
And then she concludes, and she says it best, where she's like, I realize now my survival was so that I'd be there for my family, but knowing this ahead of time prepared me. And the sadness and the loss happened way before the actual loss happened. And, the people you talk to and anyone who loses a child, I mean, that pain, I can't even imagine being in those footsteps. And having the intuition that something is wrong or that you could have stopped it or what have you is just going to spiral you down this rabbit hole because you can't change the past. It just makes you acutely aware, especially knowing that you can communicate with them. And I 100% believe in the afterlife. I 100% believe that there's life after death. But the fact that they had this experience and then they can still connect, at least, makes it slightly just, I don't even know, when people are going through grief, they have so many different stages, but then they can have, a friend of mine, David Kessler, wrote a book called Finding Meaning, the sixth stage of grief. And I think at some point, finding meaning in that helps you with your mission and helps you grow and helps you know exactly in that way what your soul is supposed to do with that pain to help others.
Yeah. Well, these are very, very deep questions that I don't think we can really grok on this level. I mean, I
Yeah.
think, and I wrestle with it. I kind of like your husband. I'm a chemical engineer,
Mm.
so I'm a very like analytical. Want to know how this thing works, and I think some people we want to know. We want to know, and I think
Mhm.
in your case or in other cases, because I was hearing you talk about, well, if you have intuition, then maybe you can avoid the circumstance that would have caused this. And we've heard about people say, I'm not going to get on that plane, and then the plane crashes, or I'm not going to get in the car and go do this thing a day. But I interviewed a woman, Nikki Allen, who's a psychic medium. She knew she was going to have an auto accident, and she was talking to the guy she was living with at the time, and said, well, I'm going to have an auto accident. He goes, well, like when and where? And she's like, well, I don't know that. So she couldn't stay out of a car for the
Right.
rest of her life.
Right.
And she ended up having an accident actually that evening. So some things I think some things are just going to happen. And I
Right.
think for people, again, that are already in grief, I just want to, say to them, don't feel guilty because you didn't know it was
100%.
coming. Yeah.
100%. And that's the thing. I mean, I've had survivor's guilt because I've told the institutions who I've spoken to, they're like, well, God saved you for a reason. I said, please don't say that. I said, because what that does is that disrespects the woman who lost her life yesterday to an AFE. I said, why am I more special than them? No, that's not the way it works. I don't believe that's the way it works. I just, I think it's the luck of the draw in this case. And yes, I spoke up. I believe that had an effect on how well I survived. But I don't want your audience to feel like they could have done anything differently to change the course. One, because you're going to be, again, going down that rabbit hole that is going to just cause much more pain because it's already happened.
Yeah.
And two, because what it will do is give a false sense to anybody else out there who is about to lose somebody close to them that they can stop whatever's happening. And it's just so painful. I can't. I have a hard time with that.
Yeah, let's get back to the lessons from your experience. Because I think there are lessons there for all of us. So one is I think to trust our intuition. It worked out very well for you in that sense. So you had this 37 seconds when your heart had stopped, and you were actually, I guess, in a coma for a while afterwards, and you were very bad shape. So when you come out, what were your recollections of that 37 seconds?
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.growth.com, or text GROWTH, GROWTH, to 31996. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF, to make a financial contribution. And now, back to Grief to Growth.
So when you come out, what were your recollections of that 37 seconds?
Zero. So I was on Steve Harvey, and Steve's like, did you see the light? And I was like, no, man, they gave me a lot of drugs, So, but that was 9 months postpartum, right? So and the lesson at that point was about listening to your intuition. And I really wanted people to understand, because when I was Googling, pregnancy, foreboding, nothing existed. I was trying to find story after story so that would help me. And so I wanted my story to get out there so that when people were feeling the same way, they'd now have a story to connect the dots to, right? So that was but then, I had gone to therapy. I had kidney failure. I had, had all these different departments. Every department at the hospital was like, how did you know? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm in a teaching hospital. Why don't you tell me? And it was really hard. It was hard getting back to being a mom and a wife. And so I would go to therapy, and therapists would be like, how can we help you? And I said, you can first tell me how it is that I saw everything months before it happened. They're like, well, let's not worry about that right now. Let's just worry about getting you out of the trauma. And I said, yeah, well, that's a problem, because for me, if I get another premonition, I'm going to freak out. What if I, detonate myself? Like I have no idea what could happen, but it could be a false sense of, and I'm scared to live. So so I ended up seeing a regression therapist who does hypnotherapy to take you back into the moments of trauma. And
Hmm.
I didn't have any huge belief that this would help. And I did it over Skype or over video conferencing. But
Mhm.
for whatever reason, I just felt like, there was nothing typical about my story. So why not do an atypical, therapy? So
Mhm.
she she talks about hypnotherapy and how, when you're in a meditative state, your memories, you can access like film strips, and they're stored in your mind. And under a meditative state, you can see what's happening. So ultimately, I videotaped my therapy. If you couldn't tell, I'm quite type A. And so I videotaped the therapy, and under hypnosis, you see me actually going through a seizure and convulse and going back into the operating room.
Hmm.
And in that moment, you see me saying, who hit the button for the code, who, jumped on my chest to do CPR, what my daughter was doing down the hall, what my husband was wearing off the plane, when I was in a coma, that what my mother was doing when she walked into the room for the first time. It was a lot of download. And,
Mhm.
you know, it's so funny, because when I was writing 37 seconds, we submitted to publishers, and one publisher said, she didn't die long enough to make it compelling, which was awesome. I have it in writing. But you know, you are right that the other people you've interviewed that have had near death experiences, there is no time and space. So space all of a sudden expanded. There were no walls, there were no ceilings. I saw everything in 3D. And you go back into those moments as an observer. So I saw Stephanie on the operating table, and then I saw my spirit perpendicular to my body. And then you
Hmm.
started seeing the EKG machine and beeping, and then up until the moment of flatline. And then with the flatline, you saw a shooting star. And then with the shooting star moment, then you see everything and all the chaos happening. But then I saw spirits. I saw my grandmother. I saw my uncle. I saw my other grandmother. I saw my aunt. And I've done research on psychologists and what psychologists are saying when people are traumatized, and say,
Mhm.
well, that's wishful thinking, right? It's like you want your loved ones next to you when you're traumatized. And I said, okay, fine. Let's put a pin on the fact that my relatives were there. Cool, no problem. But it's the ones I didn't know who had messages for the ones I do know back on
Mhm.
this earthly plane. So when I saw my best friend's little brother who had passed when he was 7, I knew instantly, like, he had told me something. I had seen how he died. It was a mystery how he died, because he was
Wow.
7 years old, and he
Mhm.
had he had choked on his vomit, and he had suffocated to that. And so nobody did an autopsy. His sister was like, I don't know why they wouldn't do an autopsy. At 7 years old, you can sit up, there's no reason for this. So it was just a mystery for the last 30 some odd years,
Hmm.
40 years. And I knew, I saw his sheets in his bed. I saw how it happened. I met my father's husband, or my husband's father,
Mhm.
and he had passed in 1998. He was wearing a particular jacket. He had a coin in his hand. I had moments like this. And then I get zapped back in, right? Because, the way that I talk about it is that it's like an umbilical cord. And so once the spirit is severed from the body, that umbilical cord cuts off, but then you get pulled back in. You get pulled back in with a force to your dantian, to your inner sacred womb.
Hmm.
And so I get popped back in, and then I'm like, okay, so then what happens, right? So I come out of this one meditative moment,
Hmm.
and I feel better. And I show it to Jonathan for 2 seconds, and you're like my husband. So he looks at it and he's like, well, how do you know this isn't a recalled episode of Grey's Anatomy in your head?
Mhm.
after I was done calling him a lot of names,
Yeah.
I said, it's a fair point, right? So you can mix up thoughts, and I had a lot of trauma, and I was under a lot of medication. So I could have made all this stuff up in my head. So I called the therapist, and I said, how do you know what I'm telling you is true? And she says, sometimes the only validation we get is that the patient feels better and you feel better. And I said, well, that's not good enough for me.
Mm-hmm.
I have witnesses. So I took the tapes. Luckily, I had it on videotape, so I didn't have to say anything. I took the tapes back to the doctors who were present, and they said it's accurate to down to where we were standing, what we were sitting, what we were doing, what we were saying. And I said, and my anesthesiologist said, sure, the hearing is probably the last to go, but you most certainly couldn't have seen. And plus, you were having a C-section, you couldn't see below your neck. And once all hell broke loose, once we got you intubated, your eyes were taped shut, so you couldn't see everything else working around you. And then I kept saying to my doctor, I said, did you say this can't be happening? This can't be happening? She said, yes. But like under my breath, far away from you, you wouldn't have heard that. Mm-hmm. And she was startled by the fact that, I said, I just felt so alone. You were treating the body like a slab of meat as opposed to knowing that I was still there. Nobody was talking to me. And then I told Jonathan that my own doctor didn't deliver the baby. And he is like, what are you talking about? She was there. I said, no, she was there. I said, but the gyn-onc resident who was taking notes, who rolled her eyes at me and stopped taking notes when I was explaining what was going to happen, said she delivered the baby. And he's like, yeah. So he's like, why would you say that? She was on gyn-onc rotation. Why, that can't be true. So then we go and we meet with the OB, and I said, Julie, did you deliver Jacob? And she said, no. And I said, did the gyn-onc resident, Dr. Hugh Park, deliver the baby? And she's like, well, we're in a teaching hospital, and she was in the back hallways about 15 minutes before your procedure. So it's our job to bring in people, last minute and have them assist. So yeah, she delivered the baby. And at that point I was like, I've got my answers, right? We have a spiritual part, energetic part, quantum physics part, however you want to analyze it in all of the mind, body, spirit aspect of it. But I have enough information to say, okay, consciousness after the brain shuts down definitely exists.
Yeah.
And the fact that I keep seeing spirits and getting validation that what I saw from spirits that I didn't know was actually true, confirms that I can see this too. I was talking with Laura Lynn Jackson the other day, who was also on the Netflix series. And she says, Stephanie, we all have mediumship ability. For us, it's just, you can meditate and you can get stronger and you can actually feel things and you can build that. And I said, I'm not so sure that is my calling, and nor do I want that.
Right.
I think different people have different purposes. I do not think that's mine, but my experience tells me that life just changes from a solid to a gas, and that it does continue to exist.
Actually, I want to jump in and kind of emphasize some things that you said. One is, as I listen to you tell your story, I think it's really interesting that when you came out of your coma, that you didn't remember anything. And so some people will say, well, people have flatlined and they don't remember anything, and you didn't. So I wonder how many people might have had experiences that just don't remember. So that to me is it kind of solves, maybe is an answer to why do only like 20% of people that flatline remember any experience at all? Because some people will say, well, that means there's no near-death experience because this person flatlined and they don't remember anything. So
it's a very good point. I mean, nobody's made that point before, but that's actually a very accurate, very solid point.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I took out of it. And it's interesting that you went to regression therapy to heal the trauma, but not necessarily remember what happened when you were out. Because I don't know if you knew that you had any memories.
Oh, no, that was my point. Was every time I would ask a doctor or a therapist how it is I saw everything, because remember, it was happening in my body. So you might be the chemical engineer, my husband might be the economist, but the reality is I needed to know how the mechanism worked as well. It was not happening to him. And he was okay with compartmentalizing that entire aspect of it and saying, regress, suppress, let's move on. Everybody's healthy. Let's keep going. But for me, I continued to have visions and premonitions. They were getting stronger. So I needed to understand, Stephanie, how much time do you have from the time you have a vision to the time something happens, and how do I read it in my body, and what is happening if it comes on the left shoulder, or what happens, is it mirroring the effect when you're seeing? I needed to understand the mechanism. So, and if I had the ability to understand what happened in those 37 seconds, maybe I could see what happened during those 3 months of those visions, because that could give me more clarity and information on future premonitions. And then what happened in the medically induced coma as well. Like I was like, is there a way to find out? I wasn't so hopeful, because at the end of the day, the doctor said, look, foreboding does exist prior to having a cardiac arrest or an embolus or what have you. It is a characteristic of that, but they'd say moments before, days before, but not months before in the detail. So they couldn't give me a scientific explanation. They had theories. Right. I mean, the guy in Ankh told me it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I said, you mean to tell me that you think that I manifested my organs combining into a hemorrhage, caused myself to be cut from sternum to pelvis, flatline, be put under general anesthesia, and I thought of all this in my mind, and that is what did it? And he's like, well, I didn't say I believed it. It's just the only thing I can come up with.
Yeah.
And I said, well, that's an a-hole thing to say, because at the end of the day, I had gone through enough guilt where I was thinking I manifested this myself. So yeah, I went to the therapy to try and connect the dots. And when Steve had said that, I was like, well, I'm not afraid to say this is the end of the road. There's nothing there. But if there was a way to find out, I wanted to find out. I just was surprised at how much I found out.
Well, there's so much in that. And I'm so glad that you did, because there's a couple things, when people have NDEs, a lot of times people want to dismiss it, as you said, wishful thinking, you were under drugs, your brain was the dying brain, the last gasp, whatever. But when you have what we call a veridical NDE, like you did, where you can tell us what was going on in the room, because it's easy to say, I saw my loved one, I saw my grandmother, I saw my grandfather. We can't verify any of that. That's subjective, right? But what happened in the room is objective, and you had no physical or rational way of knowing this other than somehow your consciousness existing outside of your body. In addition, you saw these people that you didn't know that sent you back with messages that you were able to verify. So there's so much in there for the skeptic, and the true skeptic, the person says, I want to examine the evidence. There's a lot of evidence here.
I live with one, at the end of the day, the reality, and he's, hearing him say at the end of that segment on Netflix that I believe you was such a relief. I mean, I was crying, and he's like, here I am. I say I believe you, and then you throw me under the bus. And I was like, I think it was just a relief of, just a release of energy of just wanting to hear that while I was going through it. It wasn't that, and I apologized to him, because he's like, because people have reached out and said, don't be mad at your husband, forgive him. And I'm like, no, first of all, the segment was shot 1.5 years ago. Since then, we talked enough about it. But yes, I don't get attacked by skeptics the way a lot of people do, because they're like, well, how do you handle skeptics? I'm like, I welcome them, because there's nothing to hide. My case is very well documented with lots of witnesses. So please bring it, because anybody, I had somebody the other day email me, you manifested this, right? It just sent out an email just explaining how I manifested it and whatever. And I took the time and I responded. I'm like, I really would like you to explain and send me evidence, real evidence of other cases where you have seen people manifest their own flatline or whatever. Please, I'm open to it. I'm open to your theories. If anybody is more open to it, it's the one who's experiencing it. I would love to find a scientific explanation for it, because that maybe science hasn't caught up with it yet. Maybe other people are experiencing it. I'm open to it. But when you come at me with this and I respond in a way that says, please show me the evidence to it, not just throw words at a dartboard, and then they don't respond afterwards, I'm like, what, why even waste my time? Like, why, unless you're going to give me something really constructive, like why are you bothering me? Like, what is going on? So yeah, I'm just like, bring it.
I think sometimes people, the whole manifestation, and I don't know how you feel about law of attraction, manifestation, et cetera.
I do believe that, but at the end of the day, like, I've been racking my brains of where's the boundary of law of attraction? Like, where is the boundary? And I have come to the conclusion, and especially dealing with the doctors and dealing with people who have expertise in quantum physics, I'm like, where do I limit? Like, where is the boundary? Do you believe, because I've asked so many people, I'm like, do you believe that I could do it? And they're like, no, I don't believe you could do that. And I personally, in my gut, at the end of the day, that part is subjective, right? I believe that I cannot manifest myself to go through all those physical transformations because of it, because of what I thought. Where's the limit of manifestation? I can't tell you. Do I believe that law of attraction? Do I believe when I write things down or have a vision board or have some things that are clear in my head that puts energy forth in the inertia moving forward to attract that? Yeah, I believe that, but I don't know what land. If I write that I want a private jet, will it show up?
Yeah.
No idea. If it does, I will let you know. And then that's good data set.
Yeah, that would be a great piece of evidence. Yeah, I think the thing is the universe is complex, and there are a lot of conscious, besides just our own individual consciousness. And so I think we are co-creators of reality, but we are not gods in the sense that we can just imagine that this is going to happen and it happened. It hasn't worked for me so far anyway. So I think I'm with you on that, but I do love the fact that there is so much evidence in your case, and you do welcome the skeptics to come on because, I'm sure people try to pick holes in it. I do want to ask you what your beliefs were. I know you had some intuition before, but now you say with like no doubt that there's an afterlife.
Yeah.
And I know that your background is Jewish, and I know typically I don't want to stereotype, but typically Jews don't talk much about the afterlife. It's kind of a
they don't talk about it, but they believe it. The really incredible thing is that when I was writing my book, I called my rabbi and I said, is there anything here that's against Judaism? And not because I was worried about not telling my truth. I was going to tell it either way. I just wanted to know, what does Jewish law, what does halacha talk about? And so he said, no, Stephanie. He's like, we absolutely believe in the afterlife. First of all, when we talk about Mashiach, the Messiah, we talk about the dead rising from the grave. He's like, but we also talk about, during Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, one of the holiest days of the year, there's a time where they ask the community, whoever's in mourning, which is when you're saying Kaddish, they ask people who are not in mourning that year, who have not lost a parent or who have not lost a child, to step out of the room. So you step out of the room. He's like, do you know why we do that? And I said, yeah, out of respect, the people that are there mourning together, it's a community. And he's like, that is not why we do that. The reason why we do that is because we are calling the dead into the room, and those spirits are present when we are praying. And so you feel this vibration there. I said, I didn't learn that in Hebrew school. They're like, well, they don't really openly talk about it all. So they talk about Jewish law, and they talk about, the relationship to man and God and man versus man, but they don't really talk about man versus spirit. They talk about just a faith in God. And I'm like, well, I think it would be more enlightening to us spiritual folk out there who might not be Orthodox Jews and that really understand the reasonings behind certain things, because one would feel that we don't believe that there is life after death. I mean, the reality is that when you go to the Rebbe's burial, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who passed away in 94, I believe, he's the black hatter with the beard and the payas, when, in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights, when he died, he was running Lubavitch. So he was the chief rabbi, if you will. When he died, hundreds of thousands of people came, pilgrimage to New York. They were marching in the streets. They were like, the Messiah has come. He's always said that he wasn't the Messiah. And yet to this day, he is buried with his father-in-law in a cemetery in Queens. And you go to the cemetery and you write a note, and then you pray, and then you shred the note in this boxed area where both of them lay. And so they're praying to the spirits for them to hear you. So no, 100%, they absolutely believe in the afterlife. I mean, it was interesting. I had met the Rebbe in 91 when I was directing and producing music videos and doing stuff for the Jewish educational documentaries. And the Rebbe used to give dollars to people, and he used to give prophecies to them. So basically he would say, okay, here's the dollar. He would pray and whatever. I wasn't asking for anything, but he gave me I was 19 at the time. He gave me $1. And he's like, you will have difficulty having children, but you will have them. I'm like, I don't care. I'm like, I'm not interested in getting married. I'm not interested in having children. I tell the Orthodox Jews, I'm like, oh, well, I spent the $1 on a Coke. And they're like, oh, are you kidding me? And I'm like, but meanwhile, the reality is he, I can't think that he couldn't see the future. So there are people that have these abilities, and I go back to, I still just want to know how it works, but I don't deny that they exist.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm glad we had that conversation, because one of my best friends is Jewish, and we've been friends for 35, 40 years. And, he and I would have these debates. I was a Christian at the time, and he would say, well, we don't believe in the afterlife. And I'm like, yes, you do. But I think some people, even in the Jewish community, maybe because there's not as much emphasis on it, because the emphasis is on this life. It was my impression that the Jews are really interested in this life and justice in this life, and let the afterlife take care of itself.
Well, what it is that you as a Jew are responsible for doing the work in this lifetime before you can join God up in the heavens. So your gift is to stay here and work to helping to create peace on earth. And then you get to join the heavens. But no, they 100% believe. And then I think Kabbalah touches on it, the Jewish mysticism aspect of it, because they do talk about the channels and the spirits and a little bit more from the mystical part of things. But usually when you are prepared to read the Zohar in its true form, and not like from one of the Kabbalah centers that you're learning on a certain level, but what I have been told is that Orthodox rabbis have to really understand the Torah back and forth before they can even attempt to open the Zohar to learn from that. So there's supposed to be laws about before you even attempt to understand mysticism, you have to get, master something else.
So I want to ask you, do you now, since you've had this experience, how has your life changed since then?
Yeah. So, like I said on the series, that, my life has changed significantly because I laugh less. Life is a little bit more serious. The visions that I get are more about life and death, as opposed to, who's going to win the lottery, and the work that I'm doing is much more serious, and I'm connecting to people like you and to other people around the world on a much deeper soulful level, which is a trade-off from where I was before. But nevertheless, the work is so fulfilling for me, and I'm passionate about it. So it's kind of taken a first position, whereas before I was creating reality shows. So no, life is different. It's, when I had Jonathan write a chapter in my book, he was just like, this is not my book and I don't want to write it. And this is not my mission. This is your mission. And I'm like, well, people want to hear from you. I mean, I was out in a coma, so, they want to know what you were doing during this time. And were you thinking like, I told you so, and how well? He's like, no. And I took for granted that I was like, why can't you just do it? Like, I don't understand. Yeah. And later, with more awareness, I realized that my husband, it pained him to relive this moment. And I was out there talking about it and probably going into producer mode of saying, okay, no, this happened for a reason. I have found meaning in it. I'm going to help others with it. I'm going to speak about it. I'm going to talk to doctors. I'm going to talk to patients. And then I got busy doing it, and it became really a passion of mine. And he's like, yeah, but that's not a passion of mine. I want everything to go away. Like, we're good. And so it took a long time for me to understand that. I think once I understood it, I said to him, I said, okay, I got it. I won't, unless you want to do something, or you come forward or I ask you to do something, then, and you want to do it, I just won't force you to do it. So
yeah, we all have different missions, I think. So I want to ask you now, what is your view on death now? How do you feel about death? Because I know, it sounds like you were like, I don't want to die. That's the whole thing about you're not fighting this, but you're fighting for your life, really.
Yeah.
How do you feel about death now?
Yeah. The whole fight was two-pronged. One, I didn't want to go anywhere, obviously, for many reasons.
Mm-hmm.
You have a family, a new baby, a husband you love. But the biggest issue I had with why I was racing against a clock outside of the obvious was that I needed my husband to believe that life existed after death. Because if I came back and I was knocking on the door or I was present, I didn't want him to feel like that love ended because I did. And it was very painful for me to trying to prove it. And that's why I think there's so much documentation, to his credit, because I was trying to prove to him more than anyone else. Didn't make a difference what anyone else thought.
Right.
This is the love of my life. I don't want it. This cannot end this way. Like, you have to understand that this love lasts before this lifetime, and way beyond the next. And so that was one part of this race against the clock.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of death any longer. Like, the moment of impact was quite peaceful. People talk about their NDE or their actual death experience or a clinical death experience as something very peaceful. The part of the actual moments there is peaceful. It's just incredibly painful for the ones you leave physically behind. For the ones who have left, it is not painful. It's just your life as you knew it ceases to exist. But my most terrifying experiences were the 3 months before it happened. So I never want to experience that again, that kind of knowing that point of impact is going to happen. And this time I won't have, I'll just know when it's going to happen. And I think that will be more terrifying than the actual moment itself.
So I think you said, when we die, when our bodies die, that we go from a solid to a gas or something like that. And I heard you also say that our spirits can fly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things was, at the end of my book, we had a friend of ours that, was physically incapable of moving. I mean, my own father died a year and a half ago, and he had COPD and emphysema, and, through all of the traumas and broken vertebrae because of the medication, he couldn't move. So the idea that I can see spirits in different places, your loved ones are around you, and it just takes calling them or meditating them into the environment to feel them. And sometimes you'll have a splash of perfume or a flower in an odd place that just reminds you of your grandmother or your father, or hear a song that you haven't heard in ages. I was pulling up to go to a cemetery for my housekeeper, unfortunately passed from COVID. And we're driving into the cemetery for a socially distant outside, funeral. And the song Stairway to Heaven came on as soon as we hit the driveway into the cemetery. And Jonathan was the one that pointed it out. And I'm like, I find that interesting that he's the one that said that, but the reality is like there are signs everywhere. We tend to not believe them or think it's wishful thinking, and I'm just here to say it's not wishful thinking. I believe in them 100%.
Yeah, and I heard you say that we're all intuitive, but I think maybe at different levels. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. But anytime you see a dog or a bat or a cat or anything, like they have hearing or senses, like they have an extra level of sensory input that we don't have. Humans have that too. And I think that we can just fine tune them by building up to it. I think I got unplugged. I went asystolic. Like I talk about when I was a kid, I was on low voltage and then I wanted to shut it down. Then I get unplugged. I go asystolic and now I'm on high voltage. So I feel things. The only thing that bothered me, I mean, Lauren Lynn had talked to me about like, well, you can be more proficient if you just meditated and open up and you can have more out of body experiences. I said, no. I'm good. Had the one scared me to death. I'm perfectly fine not doing that again. My 15-year-old, my stepdaughter was like, she's like, can you teach me how to meditate out of my body? I'm like, no, why would you want to do that? I'm like, there's no reason to fly right now. You don't need, and the fascination with it, I understand. But when you've experienced it through trauma, it's not an exciting roller coaster. I don't like putting myself in near-death experiences, in traumatizing upside down roller coasters or just to make my stomach dry. I do not need to challenge myself this way, and nor do I need to invite every spirit into my household because I'm already distracted as it is with everything else going on, and I need at least a little bit of time a day to be a mom and a wife. And my husband would say, I think you're spending too much time with all the work and you need to spend more time with your family. And that is a valid statement. I think it would end up taking up much more time if I invite spirits in. But they did give me good tips about, if you start getting overwhelmed, I don't know the mechanics, but they're like, you can say, if a ghost is scaring your children or a ghost is like present and you just didn't invite them, you can say, you're scaring me, you need to leave. And all of a sudden it's quiet. And so I don't know if that's a, psychological or you're hearing the words outside, but when something is making noise and then stops because you've addressed it, that is some data, like that continues to happen. So I like to say, if somebody is scaring you or if you're not ready for it, you can say, I'm not ready for it. But when you are ready for it, you can invite it by saying, I would welcome this. I would welcome this contact. But show me a sign that's tangible, and maybe it'll happen sooner than later.
Wow. Well, I want to talk about some ways that people can get more from you. There's the book 37 Seconds, and the audiobook, I guess, is out fairly new.
Yeah, it just came out with a Netflix series. So, and you can go on to stephaniearnold.net/audiobook, and you can download the free prologue and get in touch that way. And my website has a direct email that comes to me. I try and get back to everybody as quickly as I can. I am conscientious enough where if I can give you direct advice, a lot of it is medical. A lot of it is, I have this foreboding. I've had pregnant women who've reached out and who have asked what to do. And, my advice is always the same, is just to speak up and to talk to the doctors. And if they're not being heard, then you talk to more doctors. And the one thing I learned, which I did not know, and this might help others, is that, I did not know that the anesthesiologists are the ones that are keeping you alive in the operating room. And I always thought that the quarterback, my doctor, was the one that was in charge of everything. But the reality is it's the anesthesiologists, and they are taught in every aspect of medicine, especially during those emergent situations. So my advice would be that if you're having any kind of foreboding or just trepidation regarding any surgery, to make a consultation with anesthesia, because more than anything else, they are trained to hear that if there is foreboding present, and they will talk you through it. But if they feel that foreboding is present, they will stop everything and they will listen to you. That more than any other physician out there.
That's good to know. And then you've got a podcast now, Knowing.
Yeah, so we shot the pilot last week. I will, when you sign up or when you opt in on the website, you'll be getting notifications. That is, I am working with the producer, director of the Netflix series Surviving Death, Ricky Stern. So she is my EP on the podcast.
Oh, wow.
And we are looking at stories of people who've had knowings. Like, you don't know how you know, you just do.
Mm-hmm.
And so stories from like veterans who have had their spidey sense and those experiences, to pregnancy stories, to, people who've had stories. One was married to a serial killer, and, how she got out of it using her own intuition. And, what I want people to take away from that is that it really doesn't matter if you think that your intuition, your sixth sense is coming from, a spiritual place or a scientific place. My point is that the more that we tell these stories, the more people can't deny that it exists. So, and the more that our stories are shared, the more the medical community can say, oh, well, I'm hearing more and more about this, and people will take it more seriously. And just because the sixth sense doesn't fit into the other five senses hardly means it doesn't exist. So when you're looking at that and how I'm getting approached by all these different stories, I'm like, these stories need to be told.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes beyond me. And, I think this is the start of the mission of, opening up, speaking up when you sense something is wrong at every level. Because like I said, what's the worst that could happen? They judge you. Okay. Everybody judges your Instagram feed. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And speaking of Instagram, people can reach me on Instagram as well at Steph Arnold 37. So that's, and Facebook and all the typical places people can find me.
Yeah. Well, I love what you said when you were talking, you were giving me the show notes about your podcast. You said, we don't know how we know, but we do. And I think, I'm a scientific person, but science has to, first of all, observe a phenomenon to believe it exists before they can study it. And we're just getting to the point where science is being open to say, maybe this is a real thing. I know they're looking at papers are coming out now about people who have near-death experiences. At least how do we treat these people that have had instead of just shoving it under the rug and saying it's not, it's not a real thing. So your work is actually really prompting people to say, let's take a look at this. And we don't need to know how it works right now. That'd be fine. I'd love to know how it works, but we don't need to know that.
Agreed. And I'm also going to take a metaphysical and a scientific look at each story because either way, any which way, there are theories. Like even in my own story and your story and all of your guest stories, there are theories, but not everything defines it 100%. Right. So there's always a hole in each theory. And so, my husband likes to say, he gives me the Sherlock Holmes quote, which I love, once you eliminate the impossible, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. And so he's perfectly fine not going down this rabbit hole. He says, I don't even know who to ask anymore. And, I just accept you can see things, but I don't need to know how you see them. And he's like, I don't understand your need to want to know how it is, but I get you need to know. He's like, I don't think you'll ever in your lifetime know how it works.
That's really interesting that the rationalist, is saying, I'm okay with believing and not knowing how it works. And you're trying to figure out how it works.
I swear to you, this is where my second book is coming from, because I feel like we've shifted positions. Like my first book, it was very spiritual. I'm like, okay, this is exactly what it is. And I'm trying to prove to him that it exists. Then he's like, I accept it. Now I'm like, wait, it keeps happening. I need to know how it works. And he's like, I don't need to know how it works. I just accept it. And I'm like, this is all messed up. I'm like, this is just completely flipped.
Yeah, that's what we're here for. We're here to learn and grow. So that's another interesting thing that's come out of this.
Yeah, 100%.
Stephanie, thanks so much for being my guest today, and thank you for your time. I know you're really busy with a lot of different projects and stuff, and the kids, so I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And if there's anything I can do, please don't hesitate to call. We're connected now.
All right, great. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay, you too. Bye.
That's it for another episode of Grief to Growth. I sure hope you got something out of it. Please stay in contact with me by reaching out at www.grieftogrowth.com. That's growth2growth.com. Or you can text the word growth to 31996. That's simply text growth, GROWTH, to 31996. Since you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you're subscribed. So hit the subscribe button and then hit the little bell here, and it'll notify you when I have new content. Always, please share the information if you enjoy it. That helps me to get more views and to get the message out to more people. Thanks a lot and have a wonderful day.